When people imagine the Middle Ages, they often picture noble knights, towering castles, and glorious battles fought in shining armor. Movies and legends have painted the era as one of honor and heroic combat, but the reality was far darker. For most medieval soldiers, the greatest fear was not meeting an enemy on an open battlefield. It was being trapped inside a city under siege. Unlike a battle which might last only a few hours, a siege could continue for weeks or even months. Hunger slowly replaced hope, disease spread through crowded streets, wells ran dry, families watched their food disappear one meal at a time. By the time enemy soldiers finally broke through the walls, many defenders were already too weak to fight. Some of history's worst massacres happened not in open fields, but inside cities that had resisted until the very end. This is the story of the bloodiest medieval sieges ever recorded, and it begins with one of the most famous cities on earth, Jerusalem. In 1095, Pope Urban II delivered a speech that would change history forever. Standing before thousands of Christians in Clermont, France, he called upon Europe to reclaim the Holy Land from Muslim rule. His words ignited a wave of religious passion unlike anything seen before. Knights sold their lands, farmers abandoned their homes, young nobles dreamed of glory, old veterans believed they could earn salvation. Within months, tens of thousands of people began marching east. This would become known as the First Crusade. But reaching Jerusalem was only half the battle. The journey itself was a nightmare. Armies crossed mountains, deserts, and hostile territories. Many never reached the Holy Land. Some died from disease, others starved. Entire groups disappeared before ever seeing the walls of Jerusalem. By the summer of 1099, the exhausted survivors finally stood before the city they had traveled thousands of miles to capture. Jerusalem was heavily fortified. Massive stone walls surrounded the city. Watchtowers overlooked every approach. Experienced Fatimid soldiers prepared for a long defense. The city's leaders knew exactly what the Crusaders wanted. They also understood what usually happened when medieval armies captured a city by force. Mercy was never guaranteed. To slow the invaders, defenders poisoned or destroyed many of the nearby wells. Without fresh water, the Crusaders would suffer under the blazing Middle Eastern sun. The plan almost worked. Temperatures climbed well above 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Water became more valuable than gold. Soldiers searched desperately for anything they could drink. Some collected morning dew, others drank muddy water from shallow pools. Animals collapsed from exhaustion. Men fainted while standing guard. The Crusaders realized they could not survive a long siege. Either Jerusalem would fall, or they would. There was another problem. They lacked the equipment needed to storm such enormous walls. Siege towers required huge amounts of timber, but there were very few forests nearby. Every piece of wood had to be gathered from miles away. Teams worked day and night. Carpenters cut beams, blacksmiths forged iron fittings, engineers assembled giant wooden towers taller than the city walls themselves. Construction continued under constant attack. Muslim archers fired arrows at anyone working outside the camp. Small cavalry raids attempted to burn the unfinished machines. Yet somehow the Crusaders kept building. Failure was no longer an option. On July 15, 1099, the final assault began. Before sunrise, siege towers rolled slowly toward the walls. Large shields protected the men, pushing them forward. Archers unleashed thousands of arrows. Catapults hurled massive stones across the battlefield. The noise was deafening. Wood cracked, steel clashed, men screamed. As one tower reached the northern wall, its drawbridge crashed down onto the battlements. Crusader knights rushed across. Hand-to-hand combat erupted only a few feet above the ground. Defenders fought desperately. Spears thrust through narrow gaps. Axes smashed shields apart. Bodies fell from the walls onto the rocks below. Every step forward cost lives. Eventually, one section of the defense collapsed. Crusaders poured into the city. Within minutes, gates were opened from the inside. Thousands more soldiers flooded Jerusalem's streets. What followed became one of the most infamous massacres of the Middle Ages. Contemporary Christian and Muslim chroniclers describe scenes of unimaginable violence. Soldiers moved from street to street. Homes were searched. Anyone carrying weapons was killed. Many civilians also died during the chaos. Some fled toward religious buildings, believing they would be protected. Others barricaded themselves inside their homes. Neither strategy offered much safety. Large groups gathered inside the Al-Aqsa Mosque. When Crusaders entered the compound, fierce fighting broke out. Several medieval writers claimed blood flowed through the courtyards. Modern historians generally view those descriptions as symbolic exaggerations rather than literal fact, but there is broad agreement that the killing was extensive and that thousands of people died during and after the city's capture. The city's Jewish community also suffered terribly. According to several historical accounts, many sought refuge together during the assault. Very few escaped unharmed. Once organized resistance ended, looting began. Gold, silver, weapons, silk, food, anything valuable disappeared. Churches, homes, markets, and government buildings were stripped of their wealth. For medieval armies, this was considered part of the reward for victory. The richer the city, the greater the prize. Yet not every crusader celebrated. Some chroniclers expressed shock at the scale of the violence. Others viewed the conquest as a divine miracle. The same event inspired both triumph and horror depending on who recorded it. Exactly how many people died remains unknown. Medieval writers often exaggerated numbers dramatically. Some claimed 70,000 victims. Modern estimates are far lower, with many historians suggesting that several thousand to perhaps around 10,000 people may have been killed during the assault and its aftermath, though precise figures cannot be confirmed. Even by medieval standards, Jerusalem was remembered as one of the bloodiest captures of its age. But as horrific as the fall of Jerusalem was, it was not the darkest chapter of the First Crusade. Months earlier, another city had witnessed events so disturbing that chroniclers struggled to describe them. A place where starvation became more terrifying than the enemy outside the walls. A city called al-Numan. Long before Jerusalem fell, another city became the scene of one of the darkest episodes of the First Crusade. Unlike Jerusalem, al-Numan was not famous. It was not a holy city. It did not possess enormous walls or legendary treasures. Yet its name would become feared across the Middle East for centuries, not because of its military importance, but because of what happened after the walls were breached. By late 1098, the Crusaders were barely recognizable as the army that had left Europe 3 years earlier. Thousands had already died, some had fallen in battle, others had been claimed by disease. Many simply starved during the long march across Anatolia and Syria. Their horses were gone, most of their supplies had disappeared months earlier. Armor that once gleamed in the sunlight was dented, rusted, and covered in dust. The men themselves were exhausted. Still, they continued moving south. Their next obstacle was the Syrian town of al-Numan. The city stood along an important route toward Jerusalem. Leaving it behind could expose the Crusaders to attacks on their supply lines. Capturing it became a necessity. The defenders knew resistance would be difficult. Marat's walls were strong enough to delay an army, but not strong enough to survive forever. Still, surrender carried enormous risks. Throughout medieval warfare, cities that resisted until the final assault often faced looting and bloodshed. The people of Marat chose to fight. Archers lined the walls, heavy stones were stacked near the battlements, every gate was reinforced. Families prepared for what they hoped would be a short siege. Instead, both armies found themselves trapped in a different battle altogether, a battle against hunger. Food inside the Crusader camp disappeared rapidly. At first, soldiers slaughtered the remaining horses, then mules, then donkeys. Soon there were almost no animals left. Medieval chroniclers describe soldiers boiling leather belts, saddles, and even pieces of old boots to make something resembling soup. The result offered almost no nutrition, but it kept some men alive for another day. Others were not so fortunate. Every morning brought new graves outside the camp. Disease spread quickly among weakened soldiers. The smell of death lingered everywhere. Inside the city, conditions were becoming just as desperate. Grain was rationed, livestock had already been consumed, families survived on tiny portions of bread and whatever vegetables remained. No one knew how much longer the siege would last. The Crusaders launched several direct assaults. Each one failed. Defenders poured arrows onto the attackers. Large rocks crashed down from the walls. Scaling ladders splintered under the weight of advancing soldiers. The losses mounted. Military leaders realized brute force alone would not capture the city. Engineers began constructing siege towers. Finding timber proved difficult. Trees from surrounding villages were cut down. Old buildings were dismantled. Every usable beam was collected. The towers rose slowly. Despite constant attacks from the defenders, construction continued day and night. Everyone understood one terrifying reality: if the city did not fall soon, the Crusaders themselves might starve first. Finally, the assault began. The massive wooden towers rolled toward the walls while archers covered the advance. Defenders desperately tried to set the structures on fire. Flaming arrows struck dry timber, smoke filled the air. But one tower survived the barrage. Its breach slammed onto the city wall. Crusader knights charged across. A brutal fight erupted atop the battlements. Sword met sword. Axes shattered shields. Men stumbled over the bodies of those who had fallen only moments earlier. Little by little, the defenders were pushed back. Soon the gates were opened from within. The Crusaders flooded into Ma'arat. The resistance collapsed. Street fighting gave way to panic. Some residents fled into mosques. Others hid inside their homes. Many were unable to escape. Like numerous medieval cities captured by storm, Ma'arat experienced widespread killing and looting after its defenses failed. Homes were searched, valuables disappeared. Weapons, jewelry and food were seized wherever they could be found. For the starving army, even small supplies of grain were treated as priceless treasure. Yet when the looting ended, the food still wasn't enough. What happened next became one of the most controversial episodes of medieval history. Several contemporary chroniclers, both European and Muslim, recorded horrifying stories that spread across the region. According to these accounts, some starving crusaders resorted to cannibalism after the city's fall. The Norman chronicler Ralph of Caen wrote shocking descriptions of bodies being cooked.
Muslim writers also repeated similar stories, portraying the Crusaders as men driven beyond the limits of human endurance. Modern historians remain cautious. Some believe these reports may have been exaggerated for propaganda or to shock readers. Others argue that at least isolated incidents could have occurred during the extreme famine. Because the sources differ in detail and medieval chronicles often mixed fact with dramatic storytelling, historians cannot state with certainty exactly what happened. What is beyond dispute, however, is this: the rumors spread rapidly, and they terrified everyone who heard them. Across Syria and Palestine, stories of Ma'arat traveled faster than armies. People whispered about foreign warriors so desperate that nothing seemed impossible. Whether every rumor was true mattered less than the fear they created. Some cities strengthened their defenses, others considered surrender before a siege even began.
Psychological warfare had become almost as powerful as military victory. Even within the Crusader ranks, the events left deep scars. Some knights believed the suffering had tested their faith. Others were ashamed of what desperation had done to the army. Discipline weakened. Arguments over leadership and supplies became increasingly common. Many soldiers questioned whether they would survive long enough to reach Jerusalem. Yet despite everything, they marched on. Driven by faith, ambition, or simple determination, the survivors continued south. Months later, they would stand before the walls of Jerusalem. History would remember that victory, but Ma'arat remained the darker memory, the siege where starvation became as deadly as any sword.
Still, even these horrors would eventually be overshadowed. More than 100 years later, another army would attack a city unlike any the medieval world had ever known. A city filled with unimaginable wealth. A city protected by walls that had resisted invaders for nearly 1,000 years. A city that should never have fallen. For nearly 1,000 years, there was one city that seemed impossible to conquer. Its walls had stopped Persians, Arabs, Bulgars, Rus, and countless other invading armies. To medieval Europeans, Constantinople was more than just a city, it was a legend. The capital of the Byzantine Empire was the richest city in Christendom. Travelers spoke of streets lined with marble, churches covered in gold mosaics, bustling markets filled with spices from Asia, and harbors crowded with ships from every corner of the known world. The jewel of the city was the Hagia Sophia. Its enormous dome dominated the skyline, dazzling visitors with its beauty and engineering. Many believed Constantinople was protected not only by its massive walls, but by God himself. Yet in 1204, the unthinkable happened. The city fell, not to a Muslim army, not to the Mongols, but to fellow Christians. The story began with the Fourth Crusade. In 1202, thousands of crusaders gathered with the goal of sailing to Egypt, which they hoped to use as a base for reclaiming Jerusalem. To transport such a massive force across the Mediterranean, they turned to the Republic of Venice. Venice agreed to build a fleet unlike any Europe had seen. Hundreds of transport ships, powerful war galleys, months of construction. The cost was enormous. When the Crusaders assembled, however, they faced a devastating problem. They didn't have enough money. Many knights had failed to arrive. The promised payments fell far short of what Venice expected. The Crusaders were deeply in debt. Venice had no intention of absorbing the loss. Its elderly but brilliant doge Enrico Dandolo proposed another solution. Instead of paying with gold, the Crusaders would fight for Venice. Their first target became the Christian city of Zara on the Adriatic coast. The attack shocked many Europeans. A crusade was supposed to fight non-Christians. Instead, Christian soldiers were attacking another Christian city. Some knights refused to participate, others reluctantly obeyed, but this decision would only be the beginning. Soon after Zara fell, a young Byzantine prince named Alexios Angelos arrived in the Crusader camp. He claimed he could solve all their problems. If the Crusaders helped him reclaim the Byzantine throne, he promised extraordinary rewards. Huge sums of money, food and supplies, military support for future crusades. The offer sounded irresistible. The Crusader leaders accepted. The fleet changed course. Its new destination was Constantinople. When the Crusaders appeared before the city in 1203, the people of Constantinople were stunned. The banners flying from the ships carried Christian crosses. These were supposed to be allies. Instead, they had come as invaders. After several fierce battles, Alexios was restored to the throne. But he quickly discovered he could not fulfill his promises.
The imperial treasury was nearly empty, taxes increased dramatically, the population grew furious, riots erupted. Within months, Alexios was overthrown and killed. The Crusaders suddenly found themselves stranded outside the greatest city in Europe. There would be no payment, no supplies, no agreement. Only one option remained: take the city by force. In April 1204, the final assault began. The Theodosian walls had defended Constantinople for centuries. 3 layers of fortification stretched across the land approach. Massive towers overlooked every section. Deep ditches made direct attacks almost impossible. From the sea, additional walls guarded the harbor. Most armies would have considered such defenses hopeless to attack. But Venice possessed something unique: its navy. Venetian sailors developed an ingenious plan. Wooden assault bridges were mounted high on the masts of warships. When the ships drew close to the sea walls, soldiers crossed directly from the decks onto the towers. It was a tactic few defenders had ever encountered. Meanwhile, attacks continued along the land walls. For hours, arrows darkened the sky. Catapults hurled stones against the defenses. Fire spread across portions of the city. At first, the Byzantines held firm. Then, the wind changed. A strong breeze pushed several Venetian ships close enough for their assault bridges to reach the walls. Small groups of crusaders gained a foothold. At the same time, other attackers broke through damaged sections of the land defenses. The city's organized resistance began to collapse. Emperor Alexios V fled during the night. Constantinople had been abandoned by its ruler. The gates were opened. The invaders entered. For the next 3 days, one of the wealthiest cities on earth was completely at the mercy of the victorious army. The scale of the looting shocked even some crusaders. Palaces were stripped bare, markets emptied, homes were ransacked, treasures collected over centuries vanished within days. Churches suffered especially heavy losses. Golden chalices, silver crosses, precious relics, works of art, anything valuable was taken. Many priceless objects were melted down simply because their metal was worth more than their artistic value. The Hagia Sophia was also plundered. Contemporary sources describe soldiers carrying away treasures from the great cathedral. Some accounts include dramatic stories that historians believe may have been exaggerated over time, but there is no doubt that the church was looted and badly desecrated during the sack. The people suffered alongside their city. Many civilians were killed during the chaos, others were taken prisoner. Families who had lived in luxury only days before suddenly found themselves homeless. Fires spread across entire neighborhoods, smoke covered the skyline. For 3 days, Constantinople became a city of fear.
When the violence finally ended, the damage was almost impossible to measure. The Crusaders had achieved a military victory, but they had also dealt the Byzantine Empire a devastating blow. A new Latin Empire was established in Constantinople. Although the Byzantines would eventually recapture their capital in 1261, the empire never fully recovered. Its economy was shattered, its military weakened, its influence declined. Many historians believe the sack of 1204 fatally weakened Byzantium, making it far more vulnerable to the Ottoman conquest in 1453. Perhaps the greatest consequence was one that couldn't be measured in gold or territory. The attack deepened the divide between Eastern Orthodox and Western Catholic Christianity. A wound created by fellow Christians proved far harder to heal than one inflicted by foreign enemies. But even after the fall of Constantinople, one great Crusader stronghold still remained in the Holy Land. For nearly a century, it stood as the last hope of the Crusader states. Its name was Acre, and in 1291 it would become the site of one final, desperate siege. By the end of the 13th century, the Crusades were dying. For almost 200 years, European kingdoms had fought to establish and defend Christian states in the Holy Land. Some cities had fallen and been retaken countless times. Castles that once symbolized hope now stood isolated, surrounded by powerful enemies. Only one great stronghold remained: Acre. Located on the Mediterranean coast, Acre had become the capital of the last Crusader kingdom. Its busy harbor connected Europe to the Holy Land, bringing merchants, pilgrims, soldiers, and supplies from across the sea. Behind its towering walls lived thousands of people: Knights of the Knights Templar, Knights Hospitaller, Italian merchants from Venice and Genoa, craftsmen, families, children. For many Christians, Acre represented the final foothold in the East. If the city fell, the Crusader states would disappear forever. The Mamluk Sultanate had already conquered nearly every major Crusader fortress in the region. One after another, castles surrendered or were destroyed. Their next objective was obvious: Acre. The campaign had originally been planned by Sultan Qalavun, one of the most successful rulers of the Mamluk Empire, but before launching the final assault, he died. His son, Sultan al-Ashraf Khalil, inherited both the throne and the mission. Unlike many medieval rulers, Khalil had no interest in lengthy negotiations. He intended to erase the last Crusader capital from the map. In the spring of 1291, a massive Mamluk army surrounded Acre. Medieval chroniclers often exaggerated army sizes, but historians agree that it was one of the largest forces assembled during the Crusades. Thousands of infantry, elite cavalry, engineers, sappers, archers, and enormous siege machines. Among them were giant trebuchets capable of throwing stones weighing hundreds of pounds. Some of these machines even had names. One was called the Victorious, another became known as the Furious. Day after day, they hurled massive boulders against Acre's walls. Each impact shook the city. Stones smashed towers, roofs collapsed, homes were reduced to rubble. Even people far from the walls were no longer safe. Life inside Acre quickly became unbearable. The bombardment rarely stopped. During the day, giant stones crashed through buildings. At night, defenders rushed to repair damaged sections of the walls. Sleep became almost impossible. Food grew scarce, prices soared. A loaf of bread became a luxury. Fresh water had to be carefully rationed. Hospitals overflowed with wounded soldiers and civilians. The smell of smoke and dust filled the streets. Every day brought more funerals. Yet despite the suffering, the defenders refused to surrender. They understood exactly what was at stake. There would be no second capital, no second chance. If Acre fell, the Crusader presence in the Holy Land would come to an end. The city's greatest defenders were the military orders: the Knights Templar, the Knights Hospitaller, and the Teutonic Knights. These professional warriors had spent their lives preparing for battles like this. They organized counterattacks whenever possible. Small groups rushed out through hidden gates to destroy enemy siege works. Sometimes they succeeded, sometimes they never returned. Meanwhile, beneath the battlefield, another deadly struggle unfolded. Mamluk engineers began digging tunnels beneath the walls. Their goal was simple: collapse the foundations. Wooden supports held the tunnels in place while workers removed earth beneath the fortifications. Once enough stone had been undermined, the supports were set on fire. As the timber burned away, entire sections of the walls collapsed. The defenders fought back by digging countermines. Underground, in cramped tunnels filled with smoke and darkness, soldiers battled face to face. Some tunnels were flooded, others were deliberately set ablaze.
Few survived these underground encounters. By mid-May, Acre's defenses were beginning to fail. Several towers had been badly damaged, large breaches appeared in the walls. The Mamluks prepared for the final assault. Before dawn on May 18, 1291, the bombardment intensified. Trebuchets hammered the city with relentless force. Then the horns sounded. Thousands of Mamluk soldiers surged toward the breaches. Archers covered the advance with waves of arrows. The defenders answered with everything they had: crossbow bolts, heavy stones, boiling water, quicklime. For a time the attackers were pushed back, but there were simply too many of them. One breach became two, then three. Soon Mamluk soldiers were pouring into the city. The fighting moved into Acre streets. Every intersection became a battlefield. Every building became a fortress. Templars and Hospitallers fought room by room, refusing to retreat. Civilians fled toward the harbor, hoping to escape by sea. What followed was chaos. Thousands of terrified people crowded the docks, ships filled beyond capacity. Some vessels pulled away, while desperate families still clung to the sides. Others capsized under the weight of too many passengers. People drowned only yards from safety. Meanwhile, Mamluk forces reached the waterfront. Those unable to board a ship faced capture or death. The city had become a trap. The last organized resistance centered on the Templar fortress. A few hundred knights barricaded themselves inside. For several more days they continued fighting. Repeated assaults failed. Finally, Mamluk engineers undermined part of the fortress. When the supports collapsed, a massive section of the building came crashing down. The collapse buried defenders and attackers alike beneath tons of stone. The last stronghold of the Crusader kingdom was gone. After the battle, Acre was systematically looted. Warehouses full of goods disappeared. Weapons, armor, and valuables became prizes for the victorious army. Many survivors were taken prisoner. Some skilled craftsmen were spared because their abilities were valuable. Others were sold into slavery. The exact number of casualties is unknown. As with many medieval battles, chroniclers offered wildly different figures, but historians agree that thousands of people died during the siege, the final assault, and its aftermath. The fall of Acre marked the end of an era. After nearly 2 centuries of warfare, the Crusader states in the Holy Land ceased to exist. The surviving knights fled to Cyprus. Military orders searched for new bases. Europe had lost its final stronghold in the east. But although the Crusades had ended, the age of great sieges was not over. A new invention was beginning to appear on battlefields across Europe. At first, it seemed unreliable, crude, even dangerous to those using it. Yet within 2 centuries, it would make even the strongest medieval castles obsolete. It was called gunpowder. When people think about medieval warfare, they usually picture knights charging across open fields, swords clashing, and banners waving in the wind. But if you had asked a medieval soldier what he feared most, the answer probably wouldn't have been a battle. It would have been a siege. A battle might last a single afternoon. A siege could last for months, sometimes even years. And unlike a battle, there was often no escape. Once the gates closed, everyone inside the walls became part of the war. Soldiers, merchants, blacksmiths, children, priests, every person shared the same fate. The 4 sieges we've explored, Jerusalem, Ma'arat al-Numan, Constantinople and Acre, were separated by centuries, yet they all followed a similar pattern. First came isolation. Roads were cut off, trade stopped, no food entered the city, no one left. Then came hunger. At first people rationed their supplies. Bread became smaller, meat disappeared, soon even grain ran out. When starvation truly took hold, people ate whatever they could find. Horses, dogs, cats, even leather belts and old boots were boiled in desperate attempts to survive. Historical records from several medieval sieges describe such desperate measures, reminding us that starvation often became a deadlier weapon than any sword. Then disease arrived. Overcrowded cities became breeding grounds for illness. Clean water was scarce. Waste accumulated in narrow streets. The dead could not always be buried quickly.
Without modern medicine, infection spread with terrifying speed. Dysentery, typhus, other deadly illnesses. Many sieges claimed more lives through disease than through combat itself. Ironically, the attackers often suffered the same fate. Large military camps lacked proper sanitation. Thousands of soldiers lived shoulder to shoulder in makeshift shelters. Poor nutrition weakened immune systems. Outbreaks swept through both armies. In medieval warfare, victory often depended not only on courage, but on which side could survive longer. Sieges also became competitions of engineering. Every generation introduced new ideas. Defenders built thicker walls, higher towers, deeper moats. Attackers responded with taller siege towers, stronger battering rams, more powerful trebuchets. Engineers designed tunnels beneath fortifications. Sappers quietly dug under walls, supporting the earth with wooden beams. When the beams were burned, entire sections of stone collapsed. The defenders fought back with countermine tunnels. Underground battles took place in complete darkness, where men fought with swords, axes and daggers in spaces barely wide enough to stand. It was warfare unlike anything seen on an open battlefield. Hollywood often shows defenders pouring boiling oil onto attackers. While this did happen occasionally, it was relatively uncommon. Oil was expensive. More often, defenders used boiling water, heated sand, lime powder, rocks, heavy timber or burning pitch, anything that could slow an assault. Every object became a weapon, even the walls themselves. For medieval cities, one decision often meant the difference between survival and destruction. Should they surrender or resist? Many commanders knew an unwritten rule of medieval warfare. If a city surrendered before its walls were breached, negotiations were still possible. Lives might be spared, property could sometimes be protected. But if the attackers had to storm the city by force, discipline often collapsed. Looting became the soldiers' reward. Homes were searched, treasures vanished, prisoners were taken. Civilians frequently suffered alongside the defenders. Although practices varied greatly between different armies, regions and time periods, resisting until the final assault often carried terrible risks. This harsh reality influenced countless decisions throughout medieval history. Then everything changed. In the 14th century, a strange new weapon appeared on European battlefields – the cannon. The earliest cannons were crude, they were inaccurate, slow to reload, sometimes they exploded, killing the men operating them. Many commanders doubted they would ever replace traditional siege engines. But technology improved rapidly. By the 15th century, massive bombards could smash stone walls that had once seemed indestructible. Fortresses designed to resist trebuchets for months could now be breached in days. One event demonstrated this transformation more dramatically than any other. In 1453, Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II surrounded Constantinople, the same city whose walls had resisted invaders for nearly 1,000 years. This time, giant cannons pounded the ancient defenses day after day. Eventually, the walls gave way. The age of a medieval castle was ending. Gunpowder had rewritten the rules of war, yet the bloodiest sieges of the Middle Ages left behind something more important than military lessons. They changed history itself. The capture of Jerusalem established the Crusader kingdom. The horrors associated with Marat spread fear throughout the region. The sack of Constantinople weakened the Byzantine Empire for generations. The fall of Acre ended nearly 2 centuries of Crusader rule in the Holy Land. Each siege reshaped kingdoms, empires, religions, trade routes, and millions of lives. Today, many of these places are peaceful historical landmarks. Visitors walk along ancient walls, they admire towering gates, they photograph ruined castles beneath clear blue skies. It is difficult to imagine that these quiet stones once echoed with screams, explosions, collapsing towers, and desperate last stands. Every crack in those walls tells a story. Every ruined tower witnessed lives changed forever. Behind every famous siege were ordinary people who simply wanted to survive another day. That may be the greatest lesson medieval history offers us. Wars are often remembered through kings and generals, but sieges remind us that history is also written by families trapped behind walls, by defenders who refused to surrender, and by civilians caught between ambition and survival. The castles remain, the walls still stand, but the people who fought, starved and died within them are long gone. Their stories, however, continue to echo through history.